The rain began just after midnight on April 3, 1945. It drummed on the canvas roofs of the American Field Hospital outside Aachen, turning the ground into black mud and washing blood from stretcher poles into shallow puddles. Inside one surgical tent, Captain Robert L. Hastings had not slept for nearly 30 hours. His sleeves were stiff with dried blood. His hands shook slightly when he reached for another pair of gloves. The war was almost over. Everyone could feel it. American forces were deep inside Germany. Town after town was falling. But in the operating tent, victory meant nothing. Men were still arriving, torn open by artillery and bullets, and every decision was a choice between life and death. At 12:47 a.m., a jeep stopped outside the receiving tent. 2 military policemen jumped out. Between them, on a wet stretcher, lay a young German woman in a soaked gray coat. Her face was pale beneath streaks of dirt. Her blonde hair clung to her forehead. One hand pressed against her lower abdomen, though she was too weak to keep pressure there. Blood had seeped through the coat and pooled beneath her. The MPs spoke quickly. She was a prisoner of war, captured earlier that evening near the village of Würselen. She had been riding in a truck with retreating German medical personnel when the vehicle was hit by shell fragments. Several were killed instantly. She survived, but barely. The woman's name was Anna Weiss. She was 24 years old and had served as a Red Cross helper attached to a Wehrmacht medical unit. She was not a combat soldier. She had spent most of the war changing bandages, carrying stretchers, and writing letters for wounded men who could no longer hold a pen. Yet in the final weeks of the war, distinctions meant little. Uniforms were enough. Anna drifted in and out of consciousness as orderlies carried her into the triage area. The tent smelled of ether, wet canvas, and blood. Lamps swung overhead. Somewhere nearby a man cried out in pain, then went silent. She recognized the sound of surgical clamps and enamel trays. She had heard those sounds thousands of times, but never from this side of the table. When an American medic cut open her coat, he found a deep wound from shell fragments that had torn through her abdomen. Her pulse was weak. Her skin was cold. Internal bleeding was almost certain. Captain Hastings glanced at the chart the medic scribbled in pencil. Female, German POW, abdominal trauma. Shock, he looked up at her face for only a second, then turned to the nurse beside him. Prep her now. For Anna, those words were more shocking than the pain. All day, rumors had spread among captured Germans. Some said American troops treated prisoners correctly. Others whispered that enemy wounded were left until it was too late. Anna had seen too much death to trust comforting stories. She expected to be questioned, ignored, or perhaps given morphine and set aside. Instead, the American surgeon was preparing to operate immediately. She forced her eyes open as they wheeled her toward the surgical tent. Rain hammered the canvas overhead. The lights blurred into white circles. The surgeon walked beside her, studying her pulse and breathing with a calm expression that revealed nothing. She stared at the red cross on his helmet liner and tried to understand what was happening. The enemy was about to operate on her. Captain Robert Hastings was 36 years old, born in Chicago, trained at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine, and called into Army service in 1942. Before the war, he had removed appendixes, delivered babies, and repaired factory injuries. In Europe, he had performed hundreds of emergency operations under canvas and shell fire. By April 1945, his decisions had become brutally simple. If a patient could be saved, he operated. If not, he moved to the next stretcher. Uniform did not change anatomy. Still, this case was different. The field hospital was overloaded. More than 60 casualties had arrived in the last 12 hours. Plasma supplies were low. Ether was limited. 2 American infantrymen were waiting for surgery. Both were wounded, but stable enough to survive a short delay. Anna was not. If Hastings waited, she would bleed to death. He did not ask for permission. Inside the operating tent, nurses cut away the rest of Anna's clothing. Warm blankets were placed around her shoulders. A corpsman inserted a needle into her arm and hung one of the last bottles of plasma from a metal stand. Anna noticed the dark fluid moving down the tube. American plasma. Being given to a German prisoner. She tried to speak, but the words came out as a whisper. "You're operating on me?" The anesthetist leaned closer, not fully understanding her German-accented English. But Captain Hastings heard her clearly. He met her eyes for the first time. "Yes," he said in a steady voice. "We are." There was no anger in his tone, no triumph, no hesitation. Only the matter-of-fact certainty of a surgeon beginning his work. For Anna, that simple answer was almost harder to process than the wound itself. Only hours earlier, these men had been the enemy advancing through her country. Now, one of them was trying to save her life. The anesthesia mask descended over her face. Ether filled her lungs with a sharp, sweet smell. The tent lights dimmed into distant stars. Captain Hastings scrubbed his hands in cold water, pulled on fresh gloves, and stepped to the table. The shell fragment had entered the lower abdomen and likely damaged the intestine and a major blood vessel. Without surgery, survival was nearly impossible. Scalpel, the incision was made at 1:08 a.m. Rain continued outside. Ambulances arrived. Artillery rumbled far to the east as German forces withdrew deeper into the collapsing Reich. But inside the tent, the world narrowed to exposed tissue, suction, clamps, and the surgeon's concentration. Hastings worked quickly. Blood pooled in the abdominal cavity. A torn loop of small intestine was repaired. Several fragments of metal were removed. Then he found the main source of bleeding, a lacerated pelvic vessel leaking steadily into the wound. For a few tense minutes, the patient's pulse became nearly undetectable. The anesthetist called out falling blood pressure. A nurse opened the last available unit of plasma. Hastings clamped the vessel and placed fine sutures with hands that remained steady despite his exhaustion. Slowly, the bleeding stopped. Color returned to Anna's cheeks. The pulse strengthened. No one in the tent spoke for several seconds. They had crossed the most dangerous point. The surgeon continued, repairing damaged tissue and washing the abdominal cavity to reduce infection. In 1945, even a technically successful operation offered no guarantee. Antibiotics were still limited. Shock, sepsis, and peritonitis killed many who survived the operating table. At 2:41 a.m., Hastings tied the final skin sutures. The operation had lasted 1 hour and 33 minutes. He removed his gloves and looked at the unconscious woman on the table. "She has a chance," he said. In the receiving area, another ambulance had arrived with American casualties. Hastings moved immediately to the next case. There was no ceremony, no time to reflect. Yet several nurses remembered the decision. In a night of endless wounded, the surgeon had spent scarce supplies and precious time on a prisoner who, hours earlier, had belonged to the enemy. Anna regained consciousness shortly after dawn. The rain had stopped. Pale light filtered through the tent walls. Her abdomen burned with a deep, heavy pain. But the sharp tearing sensation was gone. For a moment, she assumed she was dead. Then she heard the familiar sounds of a hospital ward, footsteps, distant coughing, clinking instruments. An American nurse adjusted her blanket and checked her pulse. Anna touched the bandage across her stomach and understood. The operation had happened. She was alive. Captain Hastings stopped by during morning rounds. He looked older in daylight, his face lined with fatigue. His uniform was wrinkled, and dark circles marked his eyes. He examined the dressing and listened to her breathing. "You lost a great deal of blood," he said slowly, choosing words she would understand. "But the surgery went well." Anna stared at him in disbelief. The question she had asked before anesthesia still echoed in her mind. Why? Why save her when American soldiers were waiting? Why use blood plasma on a prisoner? Why treat an enemy with the same care given to his own men? Hastings seemed to sense the thought before she voiced it. "I'm a surgeon," he said. "That is enough." Then he moved to the next patient. Those 5 words stayed with her for the rest of her life. Recovery was uncertain. For the next several days, fever came and went. Penicillin was administered in carefully measured doses. Nurses watched for signs of infection. Food was limited to broth and water. Each morning Anna expected to worsen. Instead, little by little, her strength returned. During those quiet days, she observed the hospital around her. American soldiers occupied most of the cots. Some joked despite missing limbs. Others stared silently at the canvas roof. Nearby were German prisoners, young and old, receiving the same dressings, injections, and examinations. Medical orderlies did not ask political questions while changing bandages. They checked pulses, recorded temperatures, and moved on. Anna had worked in wartime hospitals for years, but this experience altered her understanding of the enemy she had been taught to fear. One afternoon, she asked an American nurse about Captain Hastings. The nurse, Lieutenant Margaret O'Connell, smiled wearily. She explained that the surgeon treated anyone who reached his table alive. French civilians, American paratroopers, German prisoners, even children caught in shell fire. Once the patient was under the lamp, nationality disappeared. "He only sees the wound," O'Connell said. The statement was simple, but to Anna it felt profound. Outside the hospital, Germany was collapsing. On April 12, Franklin D. Roosevelt died in Warm Springs, and the news spread quickly through Allied camps. Weeks later, on May 8, Germany would surrender unconditionally in Reims, ending the war in Europe. But lying in her hospital cot, Anna experienced history in a far more personal way. The war had narrowed to a single decision made by a tired surgeon at 12:47 in the morning. When she was strong enough to walk, she was transferred to a prisoner processing center. Before leaving, she asked if she could thank Captain Hastings. He was in surgery. The nurse gave her a scrap of paper. On it, Anna wrote a brief message in careful English. "Thank you for treating me as a human being." The note was left on his desk beside a stained surgical logbook. Whether Hastings read it immediately, no one knows. But years later, among his wartime papers, his family reportedly found a folded note with those exact words. After the war, Anna returned to civilian life in Germany. Cities were in ruins. Food was scarce. Many people she had known were dead or missing. She married, raised children, and rarely spoke about her months as a prisoner. Yet when her family asked how she survived the final weeks of the war, she always returned to the same memory: the American doctor who looked at her not as an enemy, but as a patient. Captain Hastings returned to Chicago in late 1945. He resumed civilian practice, spending decades in operating rooms far removed from artillery and mud. Like many veterans, he said little about the war. Colleagues knew he had served in Europe. Few knew the details of the hundreds of lives he had saved under canvas. But those who worked with him noticed a consistent habit. He treated every patient with the same calm focus, whether they were wealthy businessmen or factory workers with no money. When asked why he was so meticulous, he sometimes answered with a phrase that sounded almost rehearsed. "I'm a surgeon. That is enough." The story of Anna Weiss and Robert Hastings reflects a documented reality of wartime medicine. Under the Geneva Conventions, medical personnel were required to care for wounded prisoners without discrimination. In practice, the chaos of combat often made such ideals difficult. Supplies ran out. Surgeons were exhausted. Decisions had to be made in seconds. Yet many military doctors on all sides adhered to a professional code stronger than politics. That code did not erase the brutality of war. Surgeons still chose which patients were likely to survive. Some wounded could not be saved. Others died despite every effort. But when Captain Hastings saw Anna bleeding on that stretcher, he made a decision rooted in medicine rather than nationality. The technical details of her survival were straightforward: rapid triage, plasma resuscitation, exploratory laparotomy, vessel repair, bowel suturing, postoperative antibiotics. Each step reflected standard but demanding wartime surgical practice. The emotional significance was far less ordinary. A woman who expected neglect awakened with a bandaged abdomen and a second chance at life. Imagine that moment from her perspective. You are 24 years old. Your country is collapsing. The enemy surrounds you. You are wounded so badly that each breath feels thinner than the last. You are certain you will be left behind. Then the opposing army carries you under bright lights, gives you its scarce blood plasma, and entrusts your life to a surgeon whose own men are still waiting for treatment. You lose consciousness, expecting nothing. You wake up alive. History often focuses on divisions, tanks, and surrender documents. It measures campaigns by territory gained and armies destroyed. But sometimes the true meaning of war appears in a much smaller space, under a swinging lamp in a canvas tent, where one exhausted doctor chooses to save the life directly in front of him. For Anna Weiss, the war was transformed in that instant. For Robert Hastings, it was simply the job. Yet the simplicity of his choice is exactly what makes it so powerful. He did not deliver a speech. He did not ask what side she had served. He did not weigh revenge against mercy. He saw internal bleeding and acted before it was too late. The operation itself left a scar across Anna's abdomen that she carried for the rest of her life. To others, it was an old surgical mark. To her, it was evidence that even in the final, bitter weeks of the deadliest war in human history, compassion could survive. Years later, when she told the story to her children, she described the rain on the tent, the strange smell of ether, and the American surgeon's tired face. But the detail she remembered most clearly was the answer to her frightened question. "You're operating on me?" "Yes, we are." No dramatic promise, no declaration of ideals, just a quiet statement of duty. And sometimes duty, carried out with skill and humanity, becomes something larger than heroism. It becomes proof that civilization can endure even when the world seems to be tearing itself apart. On that cold April night near Aachen, two people who should have remained enemies met under the harsh lights of an operating table. One arrived expecting death. The other was too exhausted for sentiment. Between them stood only a surgeon's oath and the belief that a wounded human being deserved every chance to live. The war would end a few weeks later. Governments would fall. Borders would change. Millions would try to rebuild their lives. But for one German woman and one American surgeon, the most important victory had already taken place in silence, while rain tapped on canvas and a heartbeat slowly grew stronger. In the end, Anna did not remember the battle that wounded her. She did not remember the shell fragment entering her body. She remembered opening her eyes at dawn and realizing that the enemy had chosen not to let her die. And Captain Robert Hastings, after countless operations in war and peace, may not have considered that night unique at all. He had seen a patient in need. He had picked up a scalpel. And he had done what a surgeon does.